Life of Mine, Part 1, 1813 to 1842. I was born at Leipzig on the 22nd of May, 1813, in a room on the second floor of the Red and White Lion, and 2 days later was baptized at St. Thomas' Church and christened Wilhelm Richard. My father, Friedrich Wagner, was at the time of my birth a clerk in the police service at Leipzig, and hoped to get the post of chief constable in that town, but he died in the October of that same year. His death was partly due to the great exertions imposed upon him by the stress of police work during the war troubles and the Battle of Leipzig, and partly to the fact that he fell a victim to the nervous fever which was raging at that time. As regards his father's position in life, I learnt later that he had held a small civil appointment as toll collector at the Randstedt Gate, but had distinguished himself from those in the same station by giving his 2 sons a superior education, my father, Friedrich, studying law, and the younger son, Adolf, theology. My uncle subsequently exercised no small influence on my development. We shall meet him again at a critical turning point in the story of my youth. My father, whom I had lost so early, was, as I discovered afterwards, a great lover of poetry and literature in general, and possessed in particular an almost passionate affection for the drama, which was at that time much in vogue among the educated classes. My mother told me, among other things, that he took her to Lochstad for the first performance of the Brot von Messina, and that on the promenade he pointed out Schiller and Goethe to her, and reproved her warmly for never having heard of these great men. He is said to have been not altogether free from a gallant interest in actresses. My mother used to complain jokingly that she often had to keep lunch waiting for him while he was paying court to a certain famous actress of the day. When she scolded him, he vowed that he had been delayed by papers that had to be attended to, and as a proof of his assertion pointed to his fingers, which were supposed to be stained with ink, but on closer inspection were found to be quite clean. His great fondness for the theater was further shown by his choice of the actor Ludwig Geyer as one of his intimate friends. Although his choice of this friend was no doubt mainly due to his love for the theater, he at the same time introduced into his family the noblest of benefactors. For this modest artist, prompted by a warm interest in the lot of his friend's large family, so unexpectedly left destitute, devoted the remainder of his life to making strenuous efforts to maintain and educate the orphans. Even when the police official was spending his evenings at the theater, the worthy actor generally filled his place in the family circle, and it seems had frequently to appease my mother, who, rightly or wrongly, complained of the frivolity of her husband. How deeply the homeless artist, hard-pressed by life and tossed to and fro, longed to feel himself at home in a sympathetic family circle, was proved by the fact that a year after his friend's death he married his widow, and from that time forward became a most loving father to the 7 children that had been left behind. In this onerous undertaking he was favored by an unexpected improvement in his position, for he obtained a remunerative, respectable, and permanent engagement as a character actor at the newly established court theater in Dresden. His talent for painting, which had already helped him to earn a livelihood when forced by extreme poverty to break off his university studies, again stood him in good stead in his position at Dresden. True, he complained even more than his critics that he had been kept from a regular and systematic study of this art, yet his extraordinary aptitude, for portrait painting in particular, secured him such important commissions that he unfortunately exhausted his strength prematurely by his twofold exertions as painter and actor. Once, when he was invited to Munich to fulfill a temporary engagement at the court theater, he received, through the distinguished recommendation of the Saxon court, such pressing commissions from the Bavarian court for portraits of the royal family that he thought it wise to cancel his contract altogether. He also had a turn for poetry. Besides fragments, often in very dainty verse, he wrote several comedies, one of which, Der Bethlehemitische Kindermord, in rhymed Alexandrines, was often performed. It was published and received the warmest praise from Goethe. This excellent man, under whose care our family moved to Dresden when I was 2 years old, and by whom my mother had another daughter, Cecilia, now also took my education in hand with the greatest care and affection. He wished to adopt me altogether, and accordingly, when I was sent to my first school, he gave me his own name, so that till the age of 14 I was known to my Dresden schoolfellows as Richard Geyer. And it was not until some years after my stepfather's death, and on my family's return to Leipzig, the home of my own kith and kin, that I resumed the name of Wagner. The earliest recollections of my childhood are associated with my stepfather, and passed from him to the theater. I well remember that he would have liked to see me develop a talent for painting, and his studio, with the easel and the pictures upon it, did not fail to impress me. I remember in particular that I tried, with a childish love of imitation, to copy a portrait of King Frederick Augustus of Saxony. But when this simple daubing had to give place to a serious study of drawing, I could not stand it, possibly because I was discouraged by the pedantic technique of my teacher, a cousin of mine, who was rather a bore. At one time during my early boyhood I became so weak after some childish ailment that my mother told me later she used almost to wish me dead, for it seemed as though I should never get well. However, my subsequent good health apparently astonished my parents. I afterwards learnt the noble part played by my excellent stepfather on this occasion also. He never gave way to despair, in spite of the cares and troubles of so large a family, but remained patient throughout, and never lost the hope of pulling me through safely. My imagination at this time was deeply impressed by my acquaintance with the theater, with which I was brought into contact, not only as a childish spectator from the mysterious stage box, with its access to the stage, and by visits to the wardrobe with its fantastic costumes, wigs, and other disguises, but also by taking a part in the performances myself. After I had been filled with fear by seeing my father play the villain's part in such tragedies as Die Wees Unie der Moorder, Die beiden Gelehrensklaven, I occasionally took part in comedy. I remember that I appeared in Der Weinberg and Der Elba, a piece specially written to welcome the King of Saxony on his return from captivity, with music by the conductor, C. M. von Weber. In this I figured in a tableau vivant as an angel, sewn up in tights with wings on my back, in a graceful pose which I had laboriously practiced. I also remember on this occasion being given a big iced cake, which I was assured the king had intended for me personally. Lastly, I can recall taking a child's part in which I had a few words to speak in Kotzebue's Menschenhass Uni Rui, which furnished me with an excuse at school for not having learnt my lessons. I said I had too much to do, as I had to learn by heart an important part in Den Menschen außer der Reihe. On the other hand, to show how seriously my father regarded my education, When I was 6 years old, he took me to a clergyman in the country at Possendorf, near Dresden, where I was to be given a sound and healthy training with other boys of my own class. In the evening, the vicar, whose name was Wetzel, used to tell us the story of Robinson Crusoe and discuss it with us in a highly instructive manner. I was, moreover, much impressed by a biography of Mozart which was read aloud, and the newspaper accounts and monthly reports of the events of the Greek War of Independence stirred my imagination deeply. My love for Greece, which afterwards made me turn with enthusiasm to the mythology and history of ancient Hellas, was thus the natural outcome of the intense and painful interest I took in the events of this period. In after years, the story of the struggle of the Greeks against the Persians always revived my impressions of this modern revolt of Greece against the Turks. One day, when I had been in this country home scarcely a year, a messenger came from town to ask the vicar to take me to my parents' house in Dresden, as my father was dying. We did the 3 hours' journey on foot, and as I was very exhausted when I arrived, I scarcely understood why my mother was crying. The next day I was taken to my father's bedside. The extreme weakness with which he spoke to me, combined with all the precautions taken in the last desperate treatment of his complaint, acute hydrothorax, made the whole scene appear like a dream to me, and I think I was too frightened and surprised to cry. In the next room, my mother asked me to show her what I could play on the piano, wisely hoping to divert my father's thoughts by the sound. I played "You immer true, you in die Redlichkeit," and my father said to her, "Is it possible he has musical talent?" In the early hours of the next morning, my mother came into the great night nursery, and, standing by the bedside of each of us in turn, told us, with sobs, that our father was dead, and gave us each a message with his blessing. To me she said, "He hoped to make something of you." In the afternoon my schoolmaster, Wetzel, came to take me back to the country. We walked the whole way to Possendorf, arriving at nightfall. On the way I asked him many questions about the stars, of which he gave me my first intelligent idea. A week later my stepfather's brother arrived from Eilben for the funeral. He promised, as far as he was able, to support the family, which was now once more destitute, and undertook to provide for my future education. I took leave of my companions and of the kind-hearted clergyman, and it was for his funeral that I paid my next visit to Possendorf a few years later. I did not go to the place again till long afterwards, when I visited it on an excursion such as I often made, far into the country, at the time when I was conducting the orchestra in Dresden. I was much grieved not to find the old parsonage still there, but in its place a more pretentious modern structure, which so turned me against the locality that thenceforward my excursions were always made in another direction. This time my uncle brought me back to Dresden in the carriage. I found my mother and sister in the deepest mourning, and remember being received for the first time with a tenderness not usual in our family. And I noticed that the same tenderness marked our leave-taking, when, a few days later, my uncle took me with him to Eilben. This uncle, who was a younger brother of my stepfather, had settled there as a goldsmith, and Julius, one of my elder brothers, had already been apprenticed to him. Our old grandmother also lived with this bachelor son, and as it was evident that she could not live long, she was not informed of the death of her eldest son, which I, too, was bidden to keep to myself. The servant carefully removed the crape from my coat, telling me she would keep it until my grandmother died, which was likely to be soon. I was now often called upon to tell her about my father, and it was no great difficulty for me to keep the secret of his death, as I had scarcely realized it myself. She lived in a dark back room looking out upon a narrow courtyard, and took a great delight in watching the robins that fluttered freely about her, and for which she always kept fresh green boughs by the stove. When some of these robins were killed by the cat, I managed to catch others for her in the neighborhood, which pleased her very much, and in return, she kept me tidy and clean. Her death, as had been expected, took place before long, and the crape that had been put away was now openly worn in Ilben. The back room, with its robins and green branches, now knew me no more, but I soon made myself at home with the soap boiler's family, to whom the house belonged, and became popular with them on account of the stories I told them. I was sent to a private school kept by a man called Weiss, who left an impression of gravity and dignity upon my mind. Towards the end of the 50s, I was greatly moved at reading in a musical paper the account of a concert at Ilben, consisting of parts of Tannhauser, at which my former master, who had not forgotten his young pupil, had been present. The little old town with Luther's house, and the numberless memorials it contained of his stay there, has often, in later days, come back to me in dreams. I have always wished to revisit it and verify the clearness of my recollections, but, strange to say, it has never been my fate to do so. We lived in the marketplace, where I was often entertained by strange sights, such, for instance, as performances by a troupe of acrobats, in which a man walked a rope stretched from tower to tower across the square, an achievement which long inspired me with a passion for such feats of daring. Indeed, I got so far as to walk a rope fairly easily myself with the help of a balancing pole. I had made the rope out of cords twisted together and stretched across the courtyard, and even now I still feel a desire to gratify my acrobatic instincts. The thing that attracted me most, however, was the brass band of a hussar regiment quartered at Ilben. It often played a certain piece which had just come out, and which was making a great sensation. I mean the huntsman's chorus out of the Freischütz that had been recently performed at the opera in Berlin. My uncle and brother asked me eagerly about its composer, Weber, whom I must have seen at my parents' house in Dresden, when he was conductor of the orchestra there. About the same time the Jungfernkranz was zealously played and sung by some friends who lived near us. These two pieces cured me of my weakness for the Ypsilanti waltz, which till that time I had regarded as the most wonderful of compositions. I have recollections of frequent tussles with the town boys, who were constantly mocking at me for my square cap, and I remember, too, that I was very fond of rambles of adventure among the rocky banks of the Unstrut. My uncle's marriage late in life, and the starting of his new home, brought about a marked alteration in his relations to my family. After a lapse of a year, I was taken by him to Leipzig, and handed over for some days to the Wagners, my own father's relatives, consisting of my uncle Adolf and his sister Friedrich Wagner. This extraordinarily interesting man, whose influence afterwards became ever more stimulating to me, now for the first time brought himself and his singular environment into my life. He and my aunt were very close friends of Jeanette Tomey, a queer old maid who shared with them a large house in the marketplace, in which, if I am not mistaken, the electoral family of Saxony had, ever since the days of Augustus the Strong hired and furnished the two principal stories for their own use whenever they were in Leipzig. So far as I know, Jeanette Tomey really owned the second story, of which she inhabited only a modest apartment looking out on the courtyard. As, however, the king merely occupied the hired rooms for a few days in the year, Jeanette and her circle generally made use of his splendid apartments, and one of these staterooms was made into a bedroom for me. The decorations and fittings of these rooms also dated from the days of Augustus the Strong. They were luxurious with heavy silk and rich rococo furniture, all of which were much soiled with age. As a matter of fact, I was delighted by these large, strange rooms, looking out upon the bustling Leipzig marketplace, where I loved above all to watch the students in the crowd making their way along in their old-fashioned club attire and filling up the whole width of the street. There was only one portion of the decorations of the rooms that I thoroughly disliked, and this consisted of the various portraits, but particularly those of high-born dames in hooped petticoats, with youthful faces and powdered hair. These appeared to me exactly like ghosts, who, when I was alone in the room, seemed to come back to life, and filled me with the most abject fear. To sleep alone in this distant chamber, in that old-fashioned bed of state, beneath those unearthly pictures, was a constant terror to me. It is true I tried to hide my fear from my aunt when she lighted me to bed in the evening with her candle, but never a night passed in which I was not a prey to the most horrible ghostly visions, my dread of which would leave me in a bath of perspiration. The personality of the three chief occupants of this story was admirably adapted to materialize the ghostly impressions of the house into a reality that resembled some strange fairy tale. Jeanette Tomey was very small and stout. She wore a fair Titus wig and seemed to hug to herself the consciousness of vanished beauty. My aunt, her faithful friend and guardian, who was also an old maid, was remarkable for the height and extreme leanness of her person. The oddity of her otherwise very pleasant face was increased by an exceedingly pointed chin. My Uncle Adolphe had chosen as his permanent study a dark room in the courtyard. There it was that I saw him for the first time, surrounded by a great wilderness of books and attired in an unpretentious indoor costume, the most striking feature of which was a tall, pointed felt cap, such as I had seen worn by the clown who belonged to the troupe of rope dancers at Eilben. A great love of independence had driven him to this strange retreat. He had been originally destined for the church, but he soon gave that up in order to devote himself entirely to philological studies. But as he had the greatest dislike of acting as a professor and teacher in a regular post, he soon tried to make a meager livelihood by literary work. He had certain social gifts, and especially a fine tenor voice, and appears in his youth to have been welcome as a man of letters among a fairly wide circle of friends at Leipzig. On a trip to Jena, during which he and a companion seem to have found their way into various musical and oratorical associations, he paid a visit to Schiller. With this object in view, he had come armed with a request from the management of the Leipzig Theatre, who wanted to secure the rights of Wallenstein, which was just finished. He told me later of the magic impression made upon him by Schiller, with his tall, slight figure and irresistibly attractive blue eyes. His only complaint was that, owing to a well-meant trick played on him by his friend, he had been placed in a most trying position, for the latter had managed to send Schiller a small volume of Adolf Wagner's poems in advance. The young poet was much embarrassed to hear Schiller address him in flattering terms on the subject of his poetry, but was convinced that the great man was merely encouraging him out of kindness. Afterwards, he devoted himself entirely to philological studios, one of his best-known publications in that department being his Parnaso Italiano, which he dedicated to Goethe in an Italian poem. True, I have heard experts say that the latter was written in unusually pompous Italian, but Goethe sent him a letter full of praise, as well as a silver cup from his own household plate. The impression that I, as a boy of 8, conceived of Adolf Wagner, amid the surroundings of his own home, was that he was a peculiarly puzzling character. I soon had to leave the influence of this environment and was brought back to my people at Dresden. Meanwhile, my family, under the guidance of my bereaved mother, had been obliged to settle down as well as they could under the circumstances. My eldest brother Albert, who originally intended to study medicine, had, upon the advice of Weber, who had much admired his beautiful tenor voice, started his theatrical career in Breslau. My second sister Louisa soon followed his example and became an actress. My eldest sister Rosalie had obtained an excellent engagement at the Dresden Court Theater, and the younger members of the family all looked up to her, for she was now the main support of our poor sorrowing mother. My family still occupied the same comfortable home which my father had made for them. Some of the spare rooms were occasionally let to strangers, and Spar was among those who at one time lodged with us. Thanks to her great energy, and to help received from various sources, among which the continued generosity of the court, out of respect to the memory of my late stepfather, must not be forgotten, my mother managed so well in making both ends meet that even my education did not suffer. After it had been decided that my sister Clara, owing to her exceedingly beautiful voice, should also go on the stage, my mother took the greatest care to prevent me from developing any taste whatever for the theater. She never ceased to reproach herself for having consented to the theatrical career of my eldest brother, and as my second brother showed no greater talents than those which were useful to him as a goldsmith, it was now her chief desire to see some progress made towards the fulfillment of the hopes and wishes of my stepfather, who hoped to make something of me. On the completion of my 8th year, I was sent to the Kreuz Grammar School in Dresden, where it was hoped I would study. There I was placed at the bottom of the lowest class, and started my education under the most unassuming auspices. My mother noted with much interest the slightest signs I might show of a growing love and ability for my work. She herself, though not highly educated, always created a lasting impression on all who really learnt to know her, and displayed a peculiar combination of practical domestic efficiency and keen intellectual animation. She never gave one of her children any definite information concerning her antecedents. She came from Weissenfels and admitted that her parents had been bakers there. Even in regard to her maiden name, she always spoke with some embarrassment, and intimated that it was Perda's, though, as we afterwards ascertained, it was in reality Bert's. Strange to say, she had been placed in a high-class boarding school in Leipzig, where she had enjoyed the advantage of the care and interest of one of her father's influential friends, to whom she afterwards referred as being a Weimar prince who had been very kind to her family in Weissenfels. Her education in that establishment seems to have been interrupted on account of the sudden death of this friend. She became acquainted with my father at a very early age, and married him in the first bloom of her youth, he also being very young, though he already held an appointment. Her chief characteristics seem to have been a keen sense of humor and an amiable temper, so we need not suppose that it was merely a sense of duty towards the family of a departed comrade that afterwards induced the admirable Ludwig Geyer to enter into matrimony with her when she was no longer youthful, but rather that he was impelled to that step by a sincere and warm regard for the widow of his friend. A portrait of her, painted by Geyer during the lifetime of my father, gives one a very favorable impression of what she must have been. Even from the time when my recollection of her is quite distinct, she always had to wear a cap owing to some slight affection of the head, so that I have no recollection of her as a young and pretty mother. Her trying position at the head of a numerous family, of which I was the 7th surviving member, the difficulty of obtaining the wherewithal to rear them, and of keeping up appearances on very limited resources, did not conduce to evolve that tender sweetness and solicitude which are usually associated with motherhood. I hardly ever recollect her having fondled me. Indeed, demonstrations of affection were not common in our family, although a certain impetuous, almost passionate and boisterous manner always characterized our dealings. This being so, it naturally seemed to me quite a great event when one night I, fretful with sleepiness, looked up at her with tearful eyes as she was taking me to bed, and saw her gaze back at me proudly and fondly, and speak of me to a visitor then present with a certain amount of tenderness. What struck me more particularly about her was the strange enthusiasm and almost pathetic manner with which she spoke of the great and of the beautiful in art. Under this heading, however, she would never have let me suppose that she included dramatic art, but only poetry, music, and painting. Consequently, she often even threatened me with her curse should I ever express a desire to go on the stage. Moreover, she was very religiously inclined. With intense fervor, she would often give us long sermons about God and the divine quality in man, during which, now and again, suddenly lowering her voice in a rather funny way, she would interrupt herself in order to rebuke one of us. After the death of our stepfather, she used to assemble us all round her bed every morning, when one of us would read out a hymn or a part of the church service from the prayer book before she took her coffee. Sometimes the choice of the part to be read was hardly appropriate, as, for instance, when my sister Clara on one occasion thoughtlessly read the prayer to be said in time of war, and delivered it with so much expression that my mother interrupted her, saying, "Oh, stop. Good gracious me. Things are not quite so bad as that. There's no war on at present." In spite of our limited means, we had lively and, as they appeared to my boyish imagination, even brilliant evening parties sometimes. After the death of my stepfather, who, thanks to his success as a portrait painter, in the later years of his life had raised his income to what for those days was a really decent total, many agreeable acquaintances of very good social position whom he had made during this flourishing period still remained on friendly terms with us, and would occasionally join us at our evening gatherings. Amongst those who came were the members of the Court Theatre, who at that time gave very charming and highly entertaining parties of their own, which, on my return to Dresden later on, I found had been altogether given up. Very delightful, too, were the picnics arranged between us and our friends at some of the beautiful spots around Dresden, for these excursions were always brightened by a certain artistic spirit and general good cheer. I remember one such outing we arranged to Loschwitz, where we made a kind of gypsy camp, in which Karl Maria von Weber played his part in the character of cook. At home we also had some music. My sister Rosalie played the piano, and Clara was beginning to sing. Of the various theatrical performances we organized in those early days, often after elaborate preparation, with the view of amusing ourselves on the birthdays of our elders, I can hardly remember one, save a parody on the romantic play of Sappho by Grillparzer, in which I took part as one of the singers in the crowd that preceded Phaon's triumphal car. I endeavored to revive these memories by means of a fine puppet show, which I found among the effects of my late stepfather, and for which he himself had painted some beautiful scenery. It was my intention to surprise my people by means of a brilliant performance on this little stage. After I had very clumsily made several puppets, and had provided them with a scanty wardrobe made from cuttings of material purloined from my sisters, I started to compose a chivalric drama in which I proposed to rehearse my puppets. When I had drafted the first scene, my sisters happened to discover the MS and literally laughed it to scorn, and, to my great annoyance, for a long time afterwards they chaffed me by repeating one particular sentence which I had put into the mouth of the heroine, and which was, "Ich höre schon den Ritter trapsen, I hear his nightly footsteps falling." I now returned with renewed ardor to the theater, with which, even at this time, my family was in close touch.
Den Freischutz in Partikular
appealed very strongly to my imagination, mainly on account of its ghostly theme. The emotions of terror and the dread of ghosts formed quite an important factor in the development of my mind. From my earliest childhood, certain mysterious and uncanny things exercised an enormous influence over me. If I were left alone in a room for long, I remember that, when gazing at lifeless objects such as pieces of furniture, and concentrating my attention upon them, I would suddenly shriek out with fright, because they seemed to me alive. Even during the latest years of my boyhood, not a night passed without my waking out of some ghostly dream and uttering the most frightful shrieks, which subsided only at the sound of some human voice. The most severe rebuke, or even chastisement, seemed to me at those times no more than a blessed release. None of my brothers or sisters would sleep anywhere near me. They put me to sleep as far as possible away from the others, without thinking that my cries for help would only be louder and longer. But in the end, they got used even to this nightly disturbance. In connection with this childish terror, what attracted me so strongly to the theater, by which I mean also the stage, the rooms behind the scenes, and the dressing rooms, was not so much the desire for entertainment and amusement such as that which impels the present-day theater-goers, but the fascinating pleasure of finding myself in an entirely different atmosphere, in a world that was purely fantastic and often gruesomely attractive. Thus to me a scene, even a wing, representing a bush or some costume or characteristic part of it, seemed to come from another world, to be in some way as attractive as an apparition, and I felt that contact with it might serve as a lever to lift me from the dull reality of daily routine to that delightful region of spirits. Everything connected with a theatrical performance had for me the charm of mystery. It both bewitched and fascinated me, and while I was trying, with the help of a few playmates, to imitate the performance of Der Freischütz, and to devote myself energetically to reproducing the needful costumes and masks in my grotesque style of painting, the more elegant contents of my sister's wardrobes, in the beautifying of which I had often seen the family occupied, exercised a subtle charm over my imagination. Nay, my heart would beat madly at the very touch of one of their dresses. In spite of the fact that, as I already mentioned, our family was not given to outward manifestations of affection, yet the fact that I was brought up entirely among feminine surroundings must necessarily have influenced the development of the sensitive side of my nature. Perhaps it was precisely because my immediate circle was generally rough and impetuous that the opposite characteristics of womanhood, especially such as were connected with the imaginary world of the theater, created a feeling of such tender longing in me. Luckily, these fantastic humors, merging from the gruesome into the mawkish, were counteracted and balanced by more serious influences undergone at school at the hands of my teachers and schoolfellows. Even there, it was chiefly the weird that aroused my keenest interest. I can hardly judge whether I had what would be called a good head for study. I think that, in general, what I really liked I was soon able to grasp without much effort, whereas I hardly exerted myself at all in the study of subjects that were uncongenial. This characteristic was most marked in regard to arithmetic and, later on, mathematics. In neither of these subjects did I ever succeed in bringing my mind seriously to bear upon the tasks that were set me. In the matter of the classics, too, I paid only just as much attention as was absolutely necessary to enable me to get a grasp of them, for I was stimulated by the desire to reproduce them to myself dramatically. In this way, Greek particularly attracted me, because the stories from Greek mythology so seized upon my fancy that I tried to imagine their heroes as speaking to me in their native tongue, so as to satisfy my longing for complete familiarity with them. In these circumstances, it will be readily understood that the grammar of the language seemed to me merely a tiresome obstacle, and by no means in itself an interesting branch of knowledge. The fact that my study of languages was never very thorough perhaps best explains the fact that I was afterwards so ready to cease troubling about them altogether. Not until much later did this study really begin to interest me again, and that was only when I learned to understand its physiological and philosophical side, as it was revealed to our modern Germanists by the pioneer work of Jacob Grimm. Then, when it was too late to apply myself thoroughly to a study which at last I had learned to appreciate, I regretted that this newer conception of the study of languages had not yet found acceptance in our colleges when I was younger. Nevertheless, by my successes in philological work, I managed to attract the attention of a young teacher at the Crews Grammar School, a master of arts named Sillig, who proved very helpful to me. He often permitted me to visit him and show him my work, consisting of metric translations and a few original poems, and he always seemed very pleased with my efforts in recitation. What he thought of me may best be judged perhaps from the fact that he made me, as a boy of about 12, recite not only Hector's farewell from the Iliad, but even Hamlet's celebrated monologue. On one occasion, when I was in the fourth form of the school, one of my schoolfellows, a boy named Stark, suddenly fell dead, and the tragic event aroused so much sympathy that not only did the whole school attend the funeral, but the headmaster also ordered that a poem should be written in commemoration of the ceremony, and that this poem should be published. Of the various poems submitted, among which there was one by myself, prepared very hurriedly, none seemed to the master worthy of the honor which he had promised, and he therefore announced his intention of substituting one of his own speeches in the place of our rejected attempts. Much distressed by this decision, I quickly sought out Professor Sillig, with the view of urging him to intervene on behalf of my poem. We thereupon went through it together. Its well-constructed and well-rhymed verses, written in stanzas of 8 lines, determined him to revise the whole of it carefully. Much of its imagery was bombastic and far beyond the conception of a boy of my age. I recollect that in one part one had drawn extensively from the monologue in Addison's Cato, spoken by Cato just before his suicide. I had met with this passage in an English grammar, and it had made a deep impression upon me. The words, "The stars shall fade away, the sun himself grow dim with age, and nature sink in years," which, at all events, were a direct plagiarism, made Sillig laugh, a thing at which I was a little offended. However, I felt very grateful to him, for, thanks to the care and rapidity with which he cleared my poem of these extravagances, it was eventually accepted by the headmaster, printed, and widely circulated. The effect of this success was extraordinary, both on my schoolfellows and on my own family. My mother devoutly folded her hands in thankfulness, and in my own mind my vocation seemed quite a settled thing. It was clear, beyond the possibility of a doubt, that I was destined to be a poet. Professor Sillig wished me to compose a grand epic, and suggested as a subject the Battle of Parnassus, as described by Pausanias. His reasons for this choice were based upon the legend related by Pausanias, viz., that in the 2nd century B.C. the Muses from Parnassus aided the combined Greek armies against the destructive invasion of the Gauls by provoking a panic among the latter. I actually began my heroic poem in hexameter verse, but could not get through the first canto. Not being far enough advanced in the language to understand the Greek tragedies thoroughly in the original, my own attempts to construct a tragedy in the Greek form were greatly influenced by the fact that quite by accident I came across August Apel's clever imitation of this style in his striking poems Polyeidos and Aedaleir. For my theme, I selected the death of Ulysses, from a fable of Hyginus, according to which the aged hero is killed by his son, the offspring of his union with Calypso. But I did not get very far with this work either, before I gave it up. My mind became so bent upon this sort of thing, that duller studies naturally ceased to interest me. The mythology, legends, and at last, the history of Greece alone attracted me. I was fond of life, merry with my companions, and always ready for a joke or an adventure. Moreover, I was constantly forming friendships, almost passionate in their ardor, with one or the other of my comrades, and in choosing my associates I was mainly influenced by the extent to which my new acquaintance appealed to my eccentric imagination. At one time it would be poetizing and versifying that decided my choice of a friend. At another, theatrical enterprises, while now and then it would be a longing for rambling and mischief. Furthermore, when I reached my 13th year, a great change came over our family affairs. My sister Rosalie, who had become the chief support of our household, obtained an advantageous engagement at the theater in Prague, with her mother and children removed in 1820, thus giving up the Dresden home altogether. I was left behind in Dresden, so that I might continue to attend the Crews Grammar School until I was ready to go up to the university. I was therefore sent to board and lodge with a family named Bohm, whose sons I had known at school, and in whose house I already felt quite at home. With my residence in this somewhat rough, poor, and not particularly well-conducted family, my years of dissipation began. I no longer enjoyed the quiet retirement necessary for work, nor the gentle, spiritual influence of my sister's companionship. On the contrary, I was plunged into a busy, restless life, full of rough horseplay and of quarrels. Nevertheless, it was there that I began to experience the influence of the gentler sex in a manner hitherto unknown to me, as the grown-up daughters of the family and their friends often filled the scanty and narrow rooms of the house. Indeed, my first recollections of boyish love date from this period. I remember a very beautiful young girl, whose name, if I am not mistaken, was Amelie Hoffman, coming to call at the house one Sunday. She was charmingly dressed, and her appearance as she came into the room literally struck me dumb with amazement. On other occasions I recollect pretending to be too helplessly sleepy to move, so that I might be carried up to bed by the girls, that being, as they thought, the only remedy for my condition. And I repeated this, because I found, to my surprise, that their attention under these circumstances brought me into closer and more gratifying proximity with them. The most important event during this year of separation from my family was, however, a short visit I paid to them in Prague. In the middle of the winter my mother came to Dresden and took me hack with her to Prague for a week. Her way of traveling was quite unique. To the end of her days, she preferred the more dangerous mode of traveling in a hackney carriage to the quicker journey by mail coach, so that we spent 3 whole days in the bitter cold on the road from Dresden to Prague. The journey over the Bohemian mountains often seemed to be beset with the greatest dangers, but happily we survived our thrilling adventures and at last arrived in Prague, where I was suddenly plunged into entirely new surroundings. For a long time the thought of leaving Saxony on another visit to Bohemia, and especially Prague, had had quite a romantic attraction for me. The foreign nationality, the broken German of the people, the peculiar headgear of the women, the native wines, the harp girls and musicians, and finally, the ever-present signs of Catholicism, its numerous chapels and shrines, all produced on me a strangely exhilarating impression. This was probably due to my craze for everything theatrical and spectacular, as distinguished from simple bourgeois customs. Above all, the antique splendor and beauty of the incomparable city of Prague became indelibly stamped on my fancy. Even in my own family surroundings I found attractions to which I had hitherto been a stranger. For instance, my sister Ottilie, only 2 years older than myself, had won the devoted friendship of a noble family, that of Count Pata, 2 of whose daughters, Jenny and Auguste, who had long been famed as the leading beauties of Prague, had become fondly attached to her. To me, such people and such a connection were something quite novel and enchanting. Besides these, certain beaux esprits of Prague, among them W. Marzano,
a strikingly handsome and charming man, were frequent visitors at our house. They often earnestly discussed the tales of Hoffman, which at that date were comparatively new, and had created some sensation. It was now that I made my first though rather superficial acquaintance with this romantic visionary, and so received a stimulus which influenced me for many years even to the point of infatuation, and gave me very peculiar ideas of the world. In the following spring, 1827, I repeated this journey from Dresden to Prague, but this time on foot, and accompanied by my friend Rudolf Bohm. Our tour was full of adventure. We got to within an hour of Teplitz the first night, and next day we had to get a lift in a wagon, as we had walked our feet sore. Yet this only took us as far as Loisitz, as our funds had quite run out. Under a scorching sun, hungry and half fainting, we wandered along bypaths through absolutely unknown country, until at sundown we happened to reach the main road just as an elegant traveling coach came in sight. I humbled my pride so far as to pretend I was a traveling journeyman, and begged the distinguished travelers for alms, while my friend timidly hid himself in the ditch by the roadside. Luckily, we decided to seek shelter for the night in an inn, where we took counsel whether we should spend the alms just received on a supper or a bed. We decided for the supper, proposing to spend the night under the open sky. While we were refreshing ourselves, a strange-looking wayfarer entered. He wore a black velvet skull-cap, to which a metal lyre was attached like a cockade, and on his back he bore a harp. Very cheerfully he set down his instrument, made himself comfortable, and called for a good meal. He intended to stay the night, and to continue his way next day to Prague, where he lived, and whither he was returning from Hanover. My good spirits and courage were stimulated by the jovial manners of this merry fellow, who constantly repeated his favorite motto, non plus ultra. We soon struck up an acquaintance, and in return for my confidence, the strolling player's attitude to me was one of almost touching sympathy. It was agreed that we should continue our journey together next day on foot. He lent me 2 20-kreutzer pieces, about 9 pence, and allowed me to write my Prague address in his pocketbook. I was highly delighted at this personal success. My harpist grew extravagantly merry. A good deal of Chernosek wine was drunk. He sang and played on his harp like a madman, continually reiterating his non plus ultra, till at last, overcome with wine, he fell down on the straw, which had been spread out on the floor for our common bed. When the sun once more peeped in, we could not rouse him, and we had to make up our minds to set off in the freshness of the early morning without him, feeling convinced that the sturdy fellow would overtake us during the day. But it was in vain that we looked out for him on the road, and during our subsequent stay in Prague. Indeed, it was not until several weeks later that the extraordinary fellow turned up at my mother's, not so much to collect payment of his loan, as to inquire about the welfare of the young friend to whom that loan had been made. The remainder of our journey was very fatiguing, and the joy I felt when I at last beheld Prague from the summit of a hill, at about an hour's distance, simply beggars description. Approaching the suburbs, we were for the second time met by a splendid carriage, from which my sister Ottilie's 2 lovely friends called out to me in astonishment. They had recognized me immediately, in spite of my terribly sunburnt face, blue linen blouse, and bright red cotton cap. Overwhelmed with shame, and with my heart beating like mad. I could hardly utter a word, and hurried away to my mother's to attend at once to the restoration of my sunburnt complexion. To this task I devoted 2 whole days, during which I swathed my face in parsley poultices, and not till then did I seek the pleasures of society. When, on the return journey, I looked back once more on Prague from the same hilltop, I burst into tears, flung myself on the earth, and for a long time could not be induced by my astonished companion to pursue the journey. I was downcast for the rest of the way, and we arrived home in Dresden without any further adventures. During the same year I again gratified my fancy for long excursions on foot by joining a numerous company of grammar school boys, consisting of pupils of several classes and of various ages, who had decided to spend their summer holidays in a tour to Leipzig. This journey also stands out among the memories of my youth, by reason of the strong impressions it left behind. The characteristic feature of our party was that we all aped the student by behaving and dressing extravagantly in the most approved student fashion. After going as far as Meissen on the market boat, our path lay off the main road, through villages with which I was as yet unfamiliar. We spent the night in the vast barn of a village inn, and our adventures were of the wildest description. There we saw a large marionette show, with almost life-sized figures. Our entire party settled themselves in the auditorium, where their presence was a source of some anxiety to the managers, who had only reckoned on an audience of peasants. Genevieve was the play given. The ceaseless silly jests and constant interpolations and jeering interruptions, in which our corps of embryo students indulged, finally aroused the anger even of the peasants, who had come prepared to weep. I believe I was the only one of our party who was pained by these impertinences, and in spite of involuntary laughter at some of my comrades' jokes, I not only defended the play itself, but also its original, simple-minded audience. A popular catchphrase which occurred in the piece has ever since remained stamped on my memory. Golo instructs the inevitable Casper that, when the Count Palatine returns home, he must tickle him behind, so that he should feel it in front. Hinten zu kitzeln, dass es vorn voll. Casper conveys Golo's order verbatim to the Count, and the latter reproaches the unmasked rogue in the following terms, uttered with the greatest pathos. O Golo, Golo, thou hast told Casper to tickle me behind, so that I shall feel it in front. From Grimma our party rode into Leipzig in open carriages, but not until we had first carefully removed all the outward emblems of the undergraduate, lest the local students we were likely to meet might make us rue our presumption. Since my first visit, when I was 8 years old, I had only once returned to Leipzig, and then for a very brief stay, and under circumstances very similar to those of the earlier visit. I now renewed my fantastic impressions of the Tomi house, but this time, owing to my more advanced education, I looked forward to more intelligent intercourse with my Uncle Adolf. An opening for this was soon provided by my joyous astonishment on learning that a bookcase in the large anteroom, containing a goodly collection of books, was my property, having been left me by my father. I went through the books with my uncle, selected at once a number of Latin authors in the handsome Zweibrück edition, along with sundry attractive-looking works of poetry and belles lettres, and arranged for them to be sent to Dresden. During this visit, I was very much interested in the life of the students. In addition to my impressions of the theater and of Prague, now came those of the so-called swaggering undergraduate. A great change had taken place in this class. When, as a lad of 8, I had my first glimpse of students, their long hair, their old German costume with the black velvet skullcap and the shirt collar turned back from the bare neck, had quite taken my fancy. But since that time the old student associations, which affected this fashion, had disappeared in the face of police prosecutions. On the other hand, the national student clubs, no less peculiar to Germans, had become conspicuous. These clubs adopted, more or less, the fashion of the day, but with some little exaggeration. Albeit, their dress was clearly distinguishable from that of other classes, owing to its picturesqueness, and especially its display of the various club colors. The comment, that compendium of pedantic rules of conduct for the preservation of a defiant and exclusive esprit de corps, as opposed to the bourgeois classes, had its fantastic side, just as the most Philistine peculiarities of the Germans have, if you probe them deeply enough. To me, it represented the idea of emancipation from the yoke of school and family. The longing to become a student coincided unfortunately with my growing dislike for drier studies and with my ever-increasing fondness for cultivating romantic poetry. The results of this soon showed themselves in my resolute attempts to make a change. At the time of my confirmation, at Easter, 1827, I had considerable doubt about this ceremony, and I already felt a serious falling off of my reverence for religious observances. The boy who, not many years before, had gazed with agonized sympathy on the altarpiece in the Kreuzkirche, Church of the Holy Cross, and had yearned with ecstatic fervor to hang upon the cross in place of the Savior, had now so far lost his veneration for the clergyman, whose preparatory confirmation classes he attended, as to be quite ready to make fun of him, and even to join with his comrades in withholding part of his class fees, and spending the money in sweets. How matters stood with me spiritually was revealed to me, almost to my horror, at the communion service, when I walked in procession with my fellow communicants to the altar to the sound of organ and choir. The shudder with which I received the bread and wine was so ineffaceably stamped on my memory that I never again partook of the communion, lest I should do so with levity. To avoid this was all the easier for me, seeing that among Protestants such participation is not compulsory. I soon, however, seized, or rather created, an opportunity of forcing a breach with the Kreuz Grammar School, and thus compelled my family to let me go to Leipzig. In self-defense against what I considered an unjust punishment with which I was threatened by the assistant headmaster, Baumgarten Crusius, for whom I otherwise had great respect, I asked to be discharged immediately from the school on the ground of sudden summons to join my family in Leipzig. I had already left the Bohm household 3 months before, and now lived alone in a small garret, where I was waited on by the widow of a court plate washer, who at every meal served up the familiar thin Saxon coffee as almost my sole nourishment. In this attic I did little else but write verses. Here, too, I formed the first outlines of that stupendous tragedy which afterwards filled my family with such consternation. The irregular habits I acquired through this premature domestic independence induced my anxious mother to consent very readily to my removal to Leipzig, the more so as a part of our scattered family had already migrated there. My longing for Leipzig, originally aroused by the fantastic impressions I had gained there, and later by my enthusiasm for a student's life, had recently been still further stimulated. I had seen scarcely anything of my sister Louisa, at that time a girl of about 22, as she had gone to the theater of Breslau shortly after our stepfather's death. Quite recently she had been in Dresden for a few days on her way to Leipzig, having accepted an engagement at the theater there. This meeting with my almost unknown sister, her hearty manifestations of joy at seeing me again, as well as her sprightly, merry disposition, quite won my heart. To live with her seemed an alluring prospect, especially as my mother and Ottilie had joined her for a while. For the first time a sister had treated me with some tenderness. When at last I reached Leipzig at Christmas in the same year, 1827, and there found my mother with Ottilie and Cecilia, my half-sister, I fancied myself in heaven. Great changes, however, had already taken place. Louisa was betrothed to a respected and well-to-do bookseller, Friedrich Brockhaus. This gathering together of the relatives of the penniless bride-elect did not seem to trouble her remarkably kind-hearted fiancé. But my sister may have become uneasy on the subject, for she soon gave me to understand that she was not taking it quite in good part. Her desire to secure an entree into the higher social circles of bourgeois life naturally produced a marked change in her manner, at one time so full of fun, and of this I gradually became so keenly sensible that finally we were estranged for a time. Moreover, I unfortunately gave her good cause to reprove my conduct. After I got to Leipzig, I quite gave up my studies and all regular schoolwork, probably owing to the arbitrary and pedantic system in vogue at the school there. In Leipzig there were two higher-class schools, one called St. Thomas's School, and the other, and the more modern, St. Nicholas's School. The latter at that time enjoyed a better reputation than the former, so there I had to go. But the council of teachers before whom I appeared for my entrance examination at the new year, 1828, thought fit to maintain the dignity of their school by placing me for a time in the upper third form, whereas at the Creuse Grammar School in Dresden I had been in the second form. My disgust at having to lay aside my Homer, from which I had already made written translations of 12 songs, and take up the lighter Greek prose writers was indescribable. It hurt my feelings so deeply and so influenced my behavior that I never made a friend of any teacher in the school. The unsympathetic treatment I met with made me all the more obstinate, and various other circumstances in my position only added to this feeling, while student life, as I saw it day by day, inspired me ever more and more with its rebellious spirit. I unexpectedly met with another cause for despising the dry monotony of school regime. I refer to the influence of my uncle, Adolf Wagner, which, though he was long unconscious of it, went a long way towards molding the growing stripling that I then was. The fact that my romantic tastes were not based solely on a tendency to superficial amusement was shown by my ardent attachment to this learned relative. In his manner and conversation he was certainly very attractive. The many-sidedness of his knowledge, which embraced not only philology but also philosophy and general poetic literature, rendered intercourse with him a most entertaining pastime, as all those who knew him used to admit. On the other hand, the fact that he was denied the gift of writing with equal charm or clearness was a singular defect which seriously lessened his influence upon the literary world, and in fact often made him appear ridiculous, as in a written argument he would perpetrate the most pompous and involved sentences. This weakness could not have alarmed me, because in the hazy period of my youth the more incomprehensible any literary extravagance was, the more I admired it. Besides which, I had more experience of his conversation than of his writings. He also seemed to find pleasure in associating with the lad who could listen with so much heart and soul. Yet unfortunately, possibly in the fervor of his discourses, of which he was not a little proud, he forgot that their substance, as well as their form, was far above my youthful powers of comprehension. I called daily to accompany him on his constitutional walk beyond the city gates, and I shrewdly suspect that we often provoked the smiles of those passers-by who overheard the profound and often earnest discussions between us. The subjects generally ranged over everything serious or sublime throughout the whole realm of knowledge. I took the most enthusiastic interest in his copious library and tasted eagerly of almost all branches of literature without really grounding myself in any one of them.